I was just a little girl back in the 80s, growing up in the quiet suburbs outside Edmonton, Canada. Life was simple then, filled with laughter, imagination, and the occasional scare that every kid secretly loves. Like many children of my time, I was a huge fan of Edgar Bergen and his famous dummy, Charlie McCarthy. Their playful banter on television sparked something in me. So when my father wandered into a small, mysterious magic shop and spotted an old ventriloquist doll on one of the shelves, he immediately thought of me. I remember the day he brought it home for my birthday. He handed it to me with a grin, saying it reminded him of Charlie McCarthy. I was over the moon, more excited than I had been for any gift before. It was the perfect present for a girl like me, obsessed with ventriloquism. The doll had a certain charm, dressed in an old-fashioned suit, with a mischievous smile permanently carved into its wooden face. But, looking back now, there was something unsettling about that smile, a hint of malice that I couldn't see back then. My father later told me about the shopkeeper. While ringing up the doll, the man had leaned over the counter and said in a low, ominous voice, "You know, when you put your hand inside the doll, he's going to come alive." My father laughed it off, thinking it was just a strange attempt at a joke. But now I wonder, what if that was a warning? I named the doll Charlie after Edgar Bergen's dummy. I loved Charlie more than anything. I played with him every day, practicing my ventriloquism and making up little skits to perform for my family. But not long after Charlie came into my life, strange things began happening. At first it was little things that could be easily brushed off as imagination. I noticed that Charlie's expression seemed to change when I wasn't looking directly at him. His fixed grin seemed to shift, becoming a mocking sneer when I wasn't paying attention. My parents didn't notice at first, but I did. How could a doll's face change? It was made of hard plastic, immovable. But sometimes, in the dim light of my bedroom at night, I could swear his eyes seemed darker, more intense, as if they were watching me. No, studying me. Still, I couldn't bring myself to put him away. I adored that doll, despite the growing sense of unease. Every night before bed, I'd carefully place Charlie in the cupboard, making sure to lock the door behind me. My family and I made a habit of shutting him away because I was so protective of him. But that was when the truly terrifying events began. One night, long after we had all gone to bed, we were awakened by the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the living room. It was a light, soft pitter-patter like a child's bare feet moving across the floor. At first we thought it might be the dog or maybe one of us who had wandered sleepily out of bed. But when we gathered in the living room, there was no one there except Charlie. He was sitting on the couch, perfectly still, with that unnerving grin fixed on his face. I froze. We all knew, that I had locked him away in the cupboard before bed. My parents tried to calm me, saying I must have forgotten, but I knew better. The doll had been locked away. Somehow, he had moved, and the only explanation my young mind could conjure was terrifying. Charlie was alive. Things only escalated from there. One afternoon, while my dad and I were out, my uncle stayed behind to house sit. He was lounging in the living room when he heard my father's voice, calling his name from the other side of the room. It was strange, as my dad wasn't home, but the voice was unmistakable. When my uncle turned around, there was no one there, no one except for Charlie, sitting on the couch with that same smirk. My uncle swore he hadn't seen the doll when he first entered the room. He hadn't even noticed when it moved. That night, when we came home, my uncle was pale, visibly shaken. He left in a hurry, mumbling something about not feeling well. He never came back to the house again. We couldn't ignore it anymore. By this time, my entire family had experienced strange occurrences. Disembodied voices calling our names, footsteps in the hall when no one was there, objects moving on their own. Every night we would lock Charlie away, only to find him out in the living room the next morning, sitting like he was waiting for us. Finally, my parents decided enough was enough. We needed to get rid of him. My mom, being a devout Christian, was convinced that the doll was possessed by something evil So, we did what we thought any rational family would do. We tried to burn him. I remember watching as my father threw the doll onto the grill in our backyard. The flames roared to life, engulfing the plastic and fabric of the doll. But Charlie didn't burn. His clothes didn't catch fire. His skin didn't melt. It was as if the flames were afraid of him. No matter how long we left him on the grill, Charlie remained untouched. My father then tried to cut him up with a large kitchen knife. The blade struck the doll's body, but it was no use. The knife couldn't penetrate the plastic. Charlie was indestructible. Terrified, we did the only thing we could think of. We dug a hole in the backyard, deep enough to bury our nightmare for good. We placed Charlie in the hole, covering him with cement. I watched as the cement dried, trapping the doll beneath the earth, and for the first time in months, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We moved away from that house not long after, but Charlie never left my mind. Even now, years later, I sometimes find myself thinking about him, wondering if, someday, he might crawl his way out of the cement. Wondering if, maybe, he's still out there somewhere waiting to find me. I'll never forget the warning the shopkeeper gave my father. When you put your hand inside the doll, he's going to come alive. I wish we had taken him seriously, because even though we buried Charlie, I'm not convinced that we've seen the last of him. And maybe, just maybe, he's waiting for his next owner. I still remember the feeling when we first moved into that old house. The smell of aged wood, the creak of every step, and the unsettling silence that seemed to stretch on for hours. My wife and I had decided to buy an old home in a quiet upstate New York town, a place we thought would be perfect to start our new life. It was charming in its own way, with its vintage architecture and rustic appeal, though I couldn't shake the odd sensation that followed me around the house. But we brushed it off, excited for the fresh start. After we settled in, my wife invited her sister to visit, bringing along her newborn baby for a few days. It felt good to have family around, especially in a house that seemed so empty. They stayed in the downstairs bedroom while my wife and I slept upstairs. That first night was peaceful enough, but something happened that neither of us could explain. The next morning, my wife sat down for breakfast with her sister and asked about something strange. "I overheard you talking to someone last night," she said, sounding curious but also a little uneasy. "Who was it?" Her sister stopped mid-bite and blinked, like she wasn't sure if she should say what she was about to. "I woke up in the middle of the night," she started slowly, "and there was an old woman standing over my baby. She wasn't doing anything, just watching." I had to tell her to get away. At first, my wife and I laughed, thinking maybe her sister had a nightmare. After all, old homes come with old stories, right? But her expression was dead serious. Her face was pale, her hands trembling just a little. That was just the beginning. The days passed, but the house didn't feel right. The atmosphere was thick with something we couldn't explain. There were moments when the air seemed to vibrate with energy, like the walls were holding onto some long-forgotten memory. We chalked it up to paranoia, trying to convince ourselves that nothing was wrong. Then one afternoon while I was at work, my wife was out tending to her garden. She heard the piercing sound of the smoke alarm going off inside the house. She raced in, heart pounding, worried something was on fire. The sound was coming from the downstairs bedroom. Yes, the same one where her sister had seen the old woman. When she opened the door, she told me later, the room was filled with a thick white fog, but it wasn't smoke. She swears that for a brief moment she saw something in the fog, something like a figure, only for it to vanish the second she stepped inside. The alarm suddenly stopped, just as abruptly as it had started. There was no fire, no smoke, nothing that could explain the fog or the alarm going off. We started hearing things after that. Lamps would shift on their own, as if someone was moving them when we weren't looking. At night, the house felt more alive than it should have. There were cold drafts that came and went without warning, and sometimes, late in the evening, I could swear I heard footsteps walking slowly down the hall, even though no one else was home. The final straw came when we decided to ask our neighbor about the house. Maybe they knew something we didn't. Turns out they knew more than we could have imagined. The house had once belonged to a 90-year-old woman who tragically died in a fire. She had been trapped inside, alone. They found her body in what was now the downstairs bedroom, the very room my wife's sister and her baby had stayed in. Suddenly, everything made sense. The figure her sister saw, the smoke alarm going off for no reason, the strange white fog. It was like the house was trying to tell us something, or someone was still there, unable to move on, trapped in the very place where she had died. Needless to say, we packed up and left as soon as we could. We fixed up the house, did what we could to make it right, but there was no escaping the feeling that the old woman was still there, watching, lingering in the place that had taken her life. We moved away, far away from that place. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls just right, I find myself thinking about that old house. I wonder if anyone else has moved in. I wonder if the new owners ever wake up in the middle of the night and see the figure of an old woman standing at the foot of their bed. I wonder if they ever hear the footsteps in the hall. We'll never know for sure what really happened in that house. But one thing is clear: we weren't alone. Not then. Not ever. The ghost nanny, as we came to call her, still lingers in my mind, a reminder that some places are never truly empty. And I don't think I'll ever forget her. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, the day I was going to marry the woman of my dreams. But, as fate would have it, that night turned out to be anything but ordinary. It was a bitterly cold night in November 2013. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you question every life decision. My best man and I set off from Fort Revenant Ridge, North Carolina, on an 800-mile road trip to Ravens End Lake, Indiana. I remember the clock glowing 1 a.m., its light the only thing warm in the freezing darkness. Temperatures had plummeted to the negative double digits, and the weather was nothing short of miserable. We were both in good spirits despite the rough conditions. After all, nothing could keep me from marrying my bride. The highway stretched out before us like a black ribbon through a sea of white snow and ice. Everything was smooth, until it wasn't. As we closed in on Indianapolis, a horrifying realization hit us. We were about to run out of gas. The needle dipped below E, and our stomachs sank in sync. Worse, neither of us had any money on hand. We had prepared for everything, or so we thought. But we hadn't planned for this. I grew up around truckers. My dad hauled freight across the country, and I spent many of my childhood nights riding shotgun in his rig. So I did what I'd seen him do countless times. I searched for a truck stop. But the highways were closed down due to the severe weather, forcing us to venture onto desolate back roads in the dead of night. After what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon a small, run-down truck stop in the middle of nowhere. Its faint neon lights flickered as if they were hanging onto life by a thread. There was one truck parked outside, but something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was entirely blacked out, no logos, no markings, just an ominous dark shape that seemed to blend with the night. My best man and I exchanged uneasy glances, but desperation overruled our instincts. We went inside. The diner was surprisingly clean, almost too tidy for a place that looked so forgotten. A lone waitress stood behind the counter while a cook moved around in the back. And there, seated in a booth, was a single truck driver. His eyes met mine as we entered, and I could have sworn there was something strange in them. Something almost too calm, too detached from reality. Despite the odd atmosphere, I gathered the courage to approach him. Explaining our predicament, I asked if he could spare a few dollars so we could make it to Indianapolis and repay him later. To my surprise, he smiled and offered to buy us both a cup of coffee. I accepted, grateful for any kindness at that point. We sat and chatted for what felt like half an hour. The trucker was kind, but vague, never sharing much about himself, but listening intently as we shared our story. Eventually, he pulled out a $20 bill from his jacket pocket and handed it to me. "That should get you to where you're headed," he said with a nod. I thanked him profusely, assuring him we'd return to repay the favor. My best man and I went back outside, filled up the tank, and set off for Indianapolis. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but that feeling of unease stuck with me. I couldn't shake the strangeness of the whole encounter. The black truck, the quiet diner in the middle of a storm, the eerie calm of the truck driver. By 10 a.m., we had made it to Indianapolis. True to my word, we headed straight to the bank, withdrew some cash, and decided to return to the diner to pay back the driver. But as we pulled up to the spot where the truck stop should have been, I felt my stomach drop. The once flickering neon lights were gone, replaced by boarded-up windows and weather-beaten wood. The diner looked like it hadn't seen life in years. We stared in disbelief. How could this place be the same one we had just visited hours earlier? We parked and got out, walking up to the diner as if maybe it was some kind of trick of the eyes. But no, this place had been abandoned for years. The only sign of life was a police cruiser parked nearby. Desperate for an explanation, we approached the officer and told him what had happened. He listened quietly, a knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. When we finished, he chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You met the ghost of three," he said. I blinked in confusion. "The ghost of three?" The officer nodded. "This diner's been shut down for over 25 years. Local legend says 3 people used to run it, a waitress, a cook, and a trucker, who was a regular here. They all died in a fire one cold winter night. Ever since, folks traveling through these parts have reported encounters just like yours. They stop here, talk to the same 3 people, and then the next day," he motioned to the boarded-up diner, "they come back, and it's like the place never existed." A chill crept up my spine, colder than any winter wind. I glanced back at my best man, who looked just as pale as I felt. The truck stop, the waitress, the cook, the truck driver, they weren't just people. They were the ghosts of those who had perished years ago. And we had sat there, drinking coffee with them, talking as if they were still alive. The officer tipped his hat, wished us well, and drove off, leaving us standing there in the biting cold, staring at the crumbling remnants of a place that shouldn't have existed. As we got back in the car and drove away, my mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. But deep down, I knew I never would. To this day, every time I fill up my gas tank, I think about that strange night on those dark, frozen roads. I think about the ghost of 3 and the $20 that got us to our destination. But most of all, I wonder, was it fate that led us there? Or something far more sinister? I never went back. Some places, some encounters, are best left in the past. If that story gave you chills, imagine what else might be out there in the shadows, waiting for its next unsuspecting visitor. If you enjoyed this creepy tale, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends who love a good scare, and subscribe to the channel for more bone-chilling stories that will keep you up at night. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new haunting experience. Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't explain.